A photograph from 1892 shows a massive airship hovering over St. Petersburg. But here's the problem. According to every history book, that technology didn't exist yet. The Wright brothers wouldn't fly for another 11 years. So what are we looking at? And why does this image, along with thousands of similar documents, vanish from official archives within 2 decades? I've spent months tracking down original sources, cross-referencing testimonies, and what I found challenges everything we're told about technological development in the late 19th century. Some researchers claim an entire empire was erased from history, along with engineering knowledge that defies our current understanding of physics. Others say it's misinterpretation of conventional technology. By the end of this investigation, you'll see 8 pieces of evidence that don't fit either narrative cleanly, and you'll have to decide what makes sense. No conclusions, just observations that someone decided weren't worth preserving. The image surfaced in 2007 during the digitization of a private collection in Moscow. An estate sale, nothing remarkable, except for one leather portfolio tucked inside a trunk that hadn't been opened since the 1920s. Inside, 43 glass plate negatives, most showing typical scenes from Imperial Russia: street vendors, Orthodox churches, aristocrats in formal dress. Then, photograph number 37. A rigid airship, approximately 200 meters in length based on the buildings and frame, positioned above Nevsky Prospect. The detail is extraordinary. You can see the gondola structure, the ribbed envelope, even what appears to be a propulsion system that doesn't match anything in aviation history. The date stamp on the negative's edge reads April 1892. I reached out to Dr. Helena Voss at the Technical University of Berlin, who specializes in early aviation history. Her response was immediate. If authentic, this predates Santos Dumont's first dirigible by 6 years and uses a frame design we don't see until the 1930s. She requested the original negative for testing. The collection's buyer refused. Within 3 months, the entire portfolio was purchased by an anonymous foundation for an undisclosed sum. The digital scans? Removed from the archive's public database due to what the institution called authentication concerns. But here's where it gets interesting. That photograph isn't alone. Between 2003 and 2015, at least 17 similar images appeared in various archives across Russia, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe. Different locations: Kazan, Astrakhan, Samarkand, Yekaterinburg. Different years, ranging from 1887 to 1913. Same basic design. Massive, rigid airships with technical features that aviation historians can't reconcile with the official timeline. The standard explanation: artistic manipulations, early photographic experiments, misidentified clouds, or conventional balloons with unusual lighting. Dr. Richard Pembroke from Cambridge published a paper in 2011 arguing exactly this, citing the primitive state of photography and the prevalence of spirit photography hoaxes in that era.
Except spirit photography was obvious fakery, double exposures creating transparent ghosts. These images show solid objects with consistent lighting, shadows that match the time of day, and scale relationships that hold up under analysis. And then there's the documentation problem. If these were hoaxes, why do they appear in personal collections, not newspapers or promotional materials? Why do some include marginal notes in Russian, Kazakh, and Tartar, describing routine observations, not sensational discoveries? One photograph from 1904, found in Almaty, has a handwritten caption that translates roughly to "Supply transport departing for eastern districts, Thursday delivery expected." Not exactly the language of a fabricated wonder. I started mapping the locations. Every single photograph that can be geographically verified comes from territories that historical maps from 1850 to 1900 label as Tartary or independent Tartary, a region covering modern-day Kazakhstan, parts of Siberia, Uzbekistan, and western China. a region that appears on maps for 300 years, then vanishes from cartography by 1920. The timing bothers me. Official history explains Tartary as a vague geographic term Europeans used for Central Asian territories they didn't understand well. As mapping improved, the term became obsolete. Simple. But the photographs suggest something else. They suggest an infrastructure, regular routes, industrial production of aircraft that supposedly didn't exist yet. So I went looking for the industrial base. Where would you manufacture airships of this scale in the late 1800s? You'd need metalworking facilities, chemical plants for hydrogen or helium, massive construction hangars, and a workforce trained in techniques that didn't officially exist yet. The archives are strange here. Records from industrial centers like Omsk, Tomsk, and Yekaterinburg during this period show significant manufacturing activity, but the product lists are vague. Large-scale transport equipment, metal framework production, gas containment systems. Nothing explicitly saying airships, but nothing ruling it out either. Then, in 1918, something changes. Records become sparse. Entire factory registries go missing. The Bolshevik Revolution provides convenient cover, but even accounting for wartime chaos, the gaps are systematic. It's not random destruction. Specific types of documents vanish, while others from the same institutions survive. A colleague in Novosibirsk told me something interesting. His grandmother worked in a records office during the 1920s. She mentioned a directive. Any documents related to imperial aerial programs were to be collected and transferred to Moscow, not destroyed on site, transferred. That suggests someone wanted to control the information, not eliminate it.
Which raises an uncomfortable question. If this technology existed, who was operating it? And if it didn't exist, why systematically remove evidence of something that never happened? The official position is clear. There were no advanced airships in Central Asia during this period. The technology didn't exist. The photographs are misinterpreted or fabricated. End of discussion. But I keep coming back to photograph 37. The way the shadow falls across Nevsky Prospect, the angle of the sun, which matches April in St. Petersburg, the architectural details of buildings that were demolished in 1924, meaning the photograph had to be taken before then, at a time when the photographer couldn't have known those buildings would become dating references. If it's a hoax, it's an extraordinarily sophisticated one. If it's real, we need to completely rethink what was happening in that part of the world. And here's what troubles me most. I found 3 more photographs last week. Different archive, different source, same design pattern. I'm planning a deep investigation into the engineering specifications visible in these images for the next video, because some of the technical details suggest principles that wouldn't be theoretically understood until decades later. If you want to see what those specifications reveal, make sure you're subscribed, because this goes deeper than just photographs, much deeper. But before we can understand the engineering, we need to understand the empire that supposedly built these machines. An empire that covered 6 million square kilometers and then disappeared from history in less than a generation. Not through gradual decline, through systematic erasure. And the question nobody seems to ask is who benefits from forgetting an entire civilization? Open a world atlas from 1700. There it is, Tartary, or Grand Tartary, sprawling across Asia from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean. Some maps subdivided into independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Muscovite Tartary. The borders are vague, but the presence is undeniable. Now open an atlas from 1930. The word has vanished completely. Same geographic space, different labels. Soviet Union, Mongolia, China. As if an entire designation was simply painted over. The conventional explanation is straightforward. Tartary was never a unified empire. It was a catch-all term European cartographers used for the vast, poorly understood interior of Asia inhabited by various Turkic and Mongol peoples. As exploration improved and nation-states consolidated, more accurate nomenclature replaced the outdated label. The name disappeared because the thing it described was never really there. That's the story in every mainstream source. But when you examine the details, complications emerge. I started with the maps themselves, not the interpretations. Guillaume de Lelille's map from 1706 shows Tartary independent with defined borders, major cities marked, and trade routes indicated. This isn't vague terra incognita. The cartographer is depicting political geography with the same specificity used for France or Spain.
John Carey's atlas from 1805 shows similar detail: population centers, provincial divisions, even infrastructure like roads connecting major settlements. These aren't speculative drawings based on travelers' tales. They're reference maps intended for trade and diplomacy. Then I found something odd in the British Library, a commercial treaty from 1812 between the East India Company and representatives from what the document calls the Free Territories of Tartary, negotiating silk and metal goods trade. The treaty specifies ports, tariffs, and delivery schedules. You don't write detailed commercial contracts with a geographic expression. You write them with political entities. The treaty was never ratified. The margins contain a note from 1815 stating, "The political situation has changed." No elaboration. So I started looking at what those political changes might have been. The early 1800s in Central Asia are usually framed as a period of fragmentation, the decline of various khanates, increasing Russian expansion, and the slow incorporation of these territories into the Tsarist Empire by mid-century. That narrative fits most of the evidence, but there are gaps. Military records from Russian expeditions into Central Asia in the 1830s and 40s describe encountering fortified settlements of unusual construction and local populations with unexpected technical capabilities. General Vasily Perovsky's 1839 campaign toward Khiva mentions in a dispatch that his forces observed aerial reconnaissance that he assumed must be large birds or atmospheric phenomena, but the description doesn't match any known wildlife. That dispatch is in the Russian State Military Archive. It's not classified, not hidden, just not widely cited because it doesn't fit the standard story of technologically inferior populations being absorbed into the empire. Then there's the linguistic puzzle. The word Tartar or Tatar persists in ethnic designations: Tatarstan, Tatar people, Crimean Tatars. These are recognized ethnic groups with documented histories, but Tartary, as a political or cultural unit, erased completely. Dr. Ainur Sabitova, an ethnographer I corresponded with in Almaty, pointed out something intriguing. In oral histories among Kazakh and Tatar communities, there are persistent references to the free cities that existed before Russian control. Not khanates, which had monarchical structures, but free cities with elected councils and merchant governance. These stories include descriptions of technologies that don't match the pastoral nomad stereotype. Oral histories aren't hard evidence. They're susceptible to embellishment and mythologization, but they're also repositories of cultural memory that sometimes preserve details written records miss. The question becomes, if Tartary was just a geographic label with no political reality, why do we have treaties referencing it as a political entity? Why do military reports describe encountering organized resistance and unexpected capabilities? Why do maps show internal provincial divisions?
And if it was a political reality, where did it go? The standard answer is absorption. The Russian Empire expanded eastward throughout the 1800s, incorporating Central Asian territories through a combination of military conquest and diplomatic annexation. By the late 1800s, the region was firmly under Russian control. The name Tartary fell out of use because the political landscape had fundamentally changed. That's historically documented and largely accurate, but it doesn't explain the systematic removal of the name from historical discourse, not just contemporary maps. Modern historical texts describing the region in earlier periods avoid the term, even when discussing eras when it was the standard designation. It's as if there's an active preference to retroactively apply modern labels to historical situations where they didn't exist yet. I'm not saying there's a conspiracy. I'm saying there's a pattern of linguistic choices that obscure continuity. When you call 18th century Central Asia the future territories of the Russian Empire,
Instead of Tartary, you're imposing a teleological framework that makes the later political outcome seem inevitable and erases the possibility that alternative political structures existed. Which brings us back to the airships. If there was a political entity or confederation in Central Asia with significant technical capabilities, and if that entity was absorbed into the Russian Empire in the mid to late 1800s, what happened to its technical infrastructure? The Russian Empire was perfectly capable of adopting useful technologies from conquered territories. They did it repeatedly. So if advanced airship technology existed in the region, why don't we see it integrated into Russian military or commercial operations? Unless we do, and it's been relabeled. The Russian Empire had a dirigible program by the early 1900s. Most histories credit French and German influence for Russian aviation development, but what if the technical foundation came from absorbed Central Asian capabilities, and the French and German connections were added later to provide a more acceptable origin story? I'm speculating now. The documentation to prove this doesn't exist in accessible archives, but the absence of documentation is itself interesting, especially given how thoroughly the Russian Empire documented military acquisitions in other contexts. What we know is this: a geographic designation covering millions of square kilometers disappears from maps within decades. Photographs suggest advanced aviation infrastructure in exactly those territories, and the technical specifications in those photographs don't match anything in the official history of flight. So either we're looking at an extraordinary series of hoaxes, or we're looking at a gap in historical knowledge that challenges fundamental assumptions about technological development. The next question is the hardest one. If this technology existed, how did it work? Because the engineering visible in these photographs shouldn't be possible with 1800s materials science, unless the materials science was different too.
The first time I really studied the technical details in these photographs, I thought there had to be a mistake. Not with the images themselves, but with my understanding of what I was seeing. Because the design elements visible in the clearest examples don't align with conventional rigid airship construction from any period. Let me be specific. A standard rigid airship, like the Zeppelins from the 1920s and 30s, used an aluminum alloy frame with fabric covering and gas cells contained inside the structure. The frame bore the structural load. The engines were mounted externally on gondolas. The whole system was heavy, required enormous amounts of hydrogen or helium, and had significant limitations on altitude and range. The Hindenburg, the largest airship ever built, was 245 meters long and required 200,000 cubic meters of hydrogen to achieve lift. Its frame used aluminum-copper-magnesium alloy developed specifically for aviation. The technology required decades of metallurgical research and industrial production capability that didn't exist before the early 20th century. That's the standard history. Now look at photograph 37 again. The airship is roughly 200 meters long based on the building scale, but the gondola structure is different. Instead of being suspended below the envelope, it appears integrated into the lower section of the hull. The frame members visible through the fabric show a lattice pattern that doesn't match the ring and girder design of German Zeppelins. And then there's the propulsion system. On a conventional dirigible, you see clear engine nacelles, propellers, visible exhaust systems. Here, the rear section shows what appear to be multiple circular openings arranged symmetrically, but no visible propellers, no external engines, no smoke or exhaust residue on the fabric. I sent high-resolution scans to 3 different aviation historians. Dr. Marcus Reinhardt from the Zeppelin Museum in Friedrichshafen said, "The configuration suggests a ducted fan system or possibly something like a modern turbofan, but those principles weren't developed until the 1930s at earliest. If this is from the 1890s, I can't explain what we're looking at." Dr. Sarah Chen from MIT's Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics was more blunt. Either the dating is wrong, the photograph is manipulated, or someone in Central Asia was developing propulsion concepts independently of Western aviation research. The third option would require rethinking technology transfer and innovation diffusion in that period.
So I started looking at what materials would be needed to build something like this with 1800s technology. Aluminum wasn't commercially available in large quantities until the 1880s, and even then it was expensive and difficult to work with. The Hall-Héroult process that made aluminum affordable was only patented in 1886. Before that, aluminum was a precious metal, costlier than gold.
Steel was available, but heavy. A steel-framed airship would require so much lifting gas that the whole concept becomes impractical. Titanium wasn't commercially produced until the 1950s. So what material could provide the necessary strength-to-weight ratio for a 200-meter rigid structure in 1890? The official answer is nothing. The technology didn't exist. But here's what bothers me. Records from mining operations in the Altai Mountains and the Ural region during the mid-1800s show production of various metal alloys for specialized industrial applications without specifying what those applications were. Export records indicate significant quantities of refined metals being transported to manufacturing centers in Central Asia. What were they manufacturing? A geologist I spoke with, Dr. Pavel Sokolov, mentioned something interesting. The Altai region has some of the most diverse mineral deposits in the world. If you had advanced metallurgical knowledge, you could potentially create alloy combinations that wouldn't be rediscovered until much later. Not because the materials weren't available, but because nobody else was looking for those specific combinations. That's speculative, but it opens a possibility. What if the limitation wasn't materials availability, but knowledge of how to process and combine those materials? Then there's the energy problem. A 200-meter airship needs propulsion. Conventional engines from the 1890s were internal combustion or steam-powered, both of which produce visible exhaust and require significant fuel storage. The weight of fuel would be a major design constraint. These photographs show no visible fuel storage, no exhaust systems, and according to some marginal notes I found, flight durations that would be impossible with conventional fuel loads. One document from 1906, part of a merchant's ledger found in Kazan, mentions air transport to Tashkent, 6 days total journey, including loading delays, no refueling stops. The distance from Kazan to Tashkent is approximately 2,000 kilometers. Covering that distance without refueling in 1906 would require either impossible fuel efficiency or a different energy source entirely. Dr. Voss, the aviation historian, calculated the fuel requirements. Using the most efficient engines available in that period, you'd need roughly 40% of your total lift capacity just for fuel. That doesn't leave much for cargo or passengers, and you certainly couldn't do it without visible fuel tanks and exhaust systems. So what powered these things? Some researchers have suggested electrical systems, but battery technology in 1900 was primitive. Lead-acid batteries were heavy and low capacity. You'd have the same problem as with fuel. The power source would consume too much of your lift capacity. There's another detail that keeps coming up in the descriptions from people who claimed to see these airships: silence.
Multiple accounts from the late 1800s and early 1900s describe airships passing overhead without the sound of engines or moving soundlessly. Now, witness testimony is unreliable and silence is relative, but it's worth noting that conventional airships are loud. The engines create significant noise, propellers create noise. The idea of a silent airship is technically nonsensical unless the propulsion system is fundamentally different. Some of the more speculative researchers talk about atmospheric electricity or ether dynamics as possible explanations. These are fringe theories with no scientific support, based on misunderstandings of 19th century electrical experiments. But here's what's interesting. Scientists in the late 1800s, including serious researchers like Nikola Tesla, were exploring electrical phenomena that didn't fit the prevailing electromagnetic theory. Tesla's wireless power transmission experiments, his work on high-frequency alternating current, his claims about extracting energy from the atmosphere. most of this was dismissed or considered impractical. What if someone actually made those concepts work, not in the way Tesla envisioned, but through different applications? I'm not claiming they did. I'm asking if the conventional explanation, aluminum frame plus hydrogen plus internal combustion engine, doesn't match what we see in these photographs. What does? The engineering questions lead to an even stranger historical problem. If this technology existed and functioned, someone somewhere witnessed it fail. Airships crash, engines malfunction, accidents happen, and when they do, people notice, especially when the accident is spectacular. Which brings us to 1908 and an event in Siberia that official history calls a meteor strike. But the people who were actually there, they described something very different, something that fell from the sky with lights, with structure, with clear evidence of being manufactured, and then, within days, everyone who saw it signed documents promising never to speak about it again. Why? June 30th, 1908, the Tunguska region of Siberia. At 7:14 in the morning, an explosion occurs with the force of approximately 10 to 15 megatons, flattening 80 million trees across 2,000 square kilometers. The shockwave is detected as far away as Britain. Night skies glow across Europe for several days afterward. The official explanation, a meteor or comet fragment exploded in the atmosphere, creating an airburst with devastating local effects, but leaving no impact crater. Case closed, right? Except for the testimonies. The first scientific expedition didn't reach the site until nearly 20 years after the event. The lead investigator, Leonid Kulik, was searching for meteorite fragments and found none, which eventually led to the airburst theory. But Kulik documented something else, extensive interviews with Evenki people who witnessed the event or lived in nearby areas. Their descriptions are in the expedition archives. Most are consistent with a massive aerial explosion, intense heat, a blinding flash, thunderous noise, trees falling, animals fleeing. All of that matches the accepted explanation. But several testimonies include details that don't fit as neatly. An Evenki man named Okchin described a great fire thunder that came from the sky in the morning, flying like a bird but burning with smoke and light, before it struck the earth and the whole world shook. The word he used, according to Kulik's notes, was Ivenel, which can mean bird, flying thing, or spirit being depending on context. Another witness, Akulina, said she saw a great silver thing moving across the sky from the south, trailing fire before it fell into the forest and the sky broke open. These could easily be poetic descriptions of a meteor. Witnesses to unusual phenomena often use familiar metaphors to describe unfamiliar events. A meteor moving through the atmosphere would look like a flying, burning object. The interpretation seems straightforward. Except there are other accounts that weren't published in Kulik's official reports. I found references to these in a secondary source, a memoir written in the 1950s by one of Kulik's assistants, Viktor Juravlev. The memoir mentions that several Evenki witnesses described the object as long like a log and moving in a strange path, not straight down, but crossing the sky before falling. They also mentioned that after the explosion, armed men came from the south and stayed in the area for several days, asking questions and making people sign papers. Juravlev's memoir was published in a small regional journal and never widely circulated. I only found it because a researcher in Krasnoyarsk mentioned it in passing in an email exchange about something else entirely. I tried to verify the claim about armed men and documents. Records from 1908 showing any kind of government expedition to the Tunguska region shortly after the event should exist if this happened. But the relevant administrative archives from that period are sparse. The official position is that due to the remoteness of the region and the political instability of that period, ongoing revolution, civil war, comprehensive documentation wasn't maintained. That's plausible, but it's also convenient. Then, in 2004, a researcher named Yuri Lobvin claimed to have interviewed descendants of Evenki families who were in the region in 1908. According to Lobvin, some families maintained oral traditions about the event that included details not in the official scientific accounts. Specifically, the object was described as deliberately controlled, changing direction before impact. After the explosion, the area was declared forbidden and families were forced to relocate. Those who refused were threatened or bribed. Some were asked to sign documents stating they had seen a natural phenomenon, nothing unusual, and would not speak about it further. Lobvin's claims were dismissed by mainstream researchers as sensationalized and lacking proper documentation. Oral histories collected a century after an event are notoriously unreliable, subject to decades of cultural drift and potential contamination from modern UFO narratives. That's a valid criticism. Lobvin also made other claims about finding metallic debris that he attributed to alien spacecraft, which understandably damaged his credibility within the scientific community. But here's the thing. You can dismiss Lobvin's interpretations while still noting that the core claim, that witnesses were pressured to sign documents and remain silent, appears in multiple sources from different time periods. Zhuravlyov's memoir from the 1950s, Lobvin's interviews from the 2000s, and a 1936 report I found in regional archives that mentions resettlement of indigenous populations following the 1908 incident. Why would forestry zones be prohibited 28 years after a meteor strike? I started looking at what else was happening in Siberia in the years immediately following 1908. There's a notable increase in military activity in the region between 1909 and 1912. Transportation of materials, construction of facilities described as meteorological observation stations in locations that seem impractical for weather monitoring, and restricted access zones that persist for years. Could this be related to the Tunguska event? Possibly. If the Russian government suspected the explosion had strategic implications, whether technological or military, they would have investigated. Securing the area and controlling information would be standard procedure. But that raises a question. What strategic implications would a meteor have? Unless they didn't think it was a meteor. Dr. Andrei Olkovatov, a physicist who has studied the Tunguska event extensively, pointed out in a paper from 2003, the official explanation relies heavily on the lack of a crater and the aerial nature of the explosion, but several witness accounts describe ground-level fires and structural damage patterns inconsistent with a simple airburst. There may have been secondary impacts or ground-level combustion sources that were never fully investigated. That's a scientific dispute about the exact nature of the event, not a claim of conspiracy. But it indicates that even within mainstream research, there are unresolved questions about what happened. And if there are unresolved questions for scientists with full access to modern analytical tools, what did investigators in 1908 know or suspect? Whatever they found or didn't find, the area remained under unusual restrictions for decades. And within a few years, tensions in Europe would explode into the First World War, a conflict that introduced aviation as a military technology for the first time. The official story says military aviation emerged from experimental civilian work in France, Germany, and Britain. But what if there was another source of technical knowledge? What if the rush to develop military aircraft wasn't just innovation, but adaptation of something discovered in those Siberian forests? Because in the years right before the war, something strange was happening in the skies over Europe. Dozens of sightings, unexplained airships, always at night, always silent, and always, when authorities investigated, the trail went cold. As if someone knew exactly how to stay hidden while testing capabilities the rest of the world wasn't supposed to see yet. Between 1900 and 1914, newspapers across Europe published hundreds of reports about mysterious airships appearing in the night sky. Britain, Germany, France, even Scandinavia, people from all social classes reported seeing large, structured craft with lights, moving silently or with low mechanical sounds, often following routes over military installations, ports, or industrial centers. The phenomenon became known as the phantom airship wave. It was covered extensively in the press at the time, then quietly forgotten after the First World War began. The standard explanation frames these sightings as mass hysteria, fueled by invasion anxiety and the era's fascination with new technology. People were nervous about German military expansion. Airships were real and becoming militarily significant. Anxiety plus new technology equals misidentified sightings and imaginative interpretations of conventional aircraft, clouds, or celestial phenomena. That's the consensus view among historians who've studied the phenomenon. But when you look at the details of specific incidents, complications emerge. January 21, 1913, Cardiff, Wales. Multiple witnesses, including police constables and a town councilman, report seeing a large airship with powerful searchlights hovering over the city around 11 p.m. The craft remains visible for approximately 17 minutes before departing to the northeast at what observers describe as remarkable speed. The Admiralty investigates. Their conclusion: misidentified stars or aircraft from European continental sources. But there's a problem with that explanation. Weather records show heavy cloud cover over Cardiff that night. Stars wouldn't have been visible. And continental European airships, the few that existed operationally in 1913, lacked the range to reach Wales and return without refueling, especially against prevailing winds. The Admiralty report acknowledges these issues, but offers no alternative explanation. The incident is closed as unexplained aerial observation, no security threat identified. Why would the Admiralty investigate at all if they thought it was just confused civilians misidentifying stars? February 2, 1913, Selby, Yorkshire. A similar report. Large craft, multiple lights, silent operation. This time the witness is a local constable who provides a detailed written statement describing a cigar-shaped vessel approximately 100 feet in length with a car or gondola beneath it carrying lights of unusual brightness, moving steadily from south to north. The constable's report is filed, investigated by military intelligence, and classified. It's declassified in 1967 with no explanation for why a sighting report warranted classification in the first place. These aren't isolated incidents. Between January and May of 1913, the British press documents over 40 similar sightings across England, Wales, and Scotland. The descriptions are remarkably consistent. Large, structured craft, often with searchlights, moving deliberately, usually at night, frequently observed near military or industrial sites. Germany experiences similar reports. A wave of sightings in the Rhineland during December 1912 describes airships of foreign origin conducting what appears to be surveillance. The German military investigates, suspects French or British reconnaissance, but can't confirm the identity of the craft. France reports unusual aerial activity along its eastern border throughout 1913. Again, the assumption is German military dirigibles, but the flight patterns and capabilities don't match known German airships of that period. Everyone suspects everyone else, but nobody can prove who's actually operating these craft. Then there's the technical problem. Operational military airships in 1913 were still experimental. Germany had the most advanced program, the Zeppelin M series, but these were relatively slow, vulnerable to weather, and had limited operational range. They certainly couldn't fly undetected over hostile territory for hours at a time. Yet the sightings describe craft that appear and disappear without being tracked to any origin or destination, that operate in weather conditions that would ground known airships, and that demonstrate speeds inconsistent with contemporary technology. It's possible all the witnesses were wrong, misidentifying conventional aircraft or natural phenomena. Mass misidentification happens, but the consistency is strange. Witnesses from different countries who couldn't have coordinated their stories describe similar craft with similar behaviors. Police reports, military observations, civilian testimonies all align on key details even as they differ on specifics. And then, in August 1914, the war starts, and suddenly nobody talks about phantom airships anymore. The First World War is the moment aviation becomes militarily significant. Reconnaissance aircraft, fighters, bombers, dirigibles all appear in combat for the first time. The development seems rapid, almost too rapid given the primitive state of aviation just a decade earlier. The conventional narrative is that war accelerates innovation. Nations pour resources into military technology and breakthroughs happen. That's historically documented. But I keep wondering about the timeline. In 1900, the Wright brothers achieved sustained powered flight for 12 seconds. 11 years later, aircraft are conducting strategic bombing missions, engaging in air-to-air combat, and providing tactical reconnaissance that changes battlefield outcomes. That's an extraordinary pace of development. Where did the knowledge come from? The standard answer is international competition and knowledge sharing among engineers. French designers influence British designs, German innovations are adopted by Russian manufacturers. Technology diffuses rapidly during wartime. That's absolutely true, but it assumes the baseline technical knowledge existed in the public sphere to be shared. What if some of it didn't? What if military intelligence services in multiple countries had been studying craft they couldn't identify for years before the war? What if those studies influenced design decisions, propulsion research, materials testing? I'm not suggesting they reverse-engineered alien spacecraft. I'm asking if European militaries were observing airships with capabilities beyond their own technology between 1909 and 1914, would they have investigated? And if they investigated, would they have applied those findings to their own programs? The answer to both questions is almost certainly yes. Whether they found anything useful is a different question, but the possibility that some military aviation development was informed by observations of unidentified craft isn't inherently unreasonable. And here's what really troubles me. After the war ends, when you'd expect all this technology to transition into civilian use, accelerate commercial aviation development, make air travel commonplace, it doesn't happen. The 1920s and 30s see airship development, yes, but it's halting, expensive, and eventually abandoned after disasters like the Hindenburg, as if the knowledge that drove wartime innovation suddenly became unavailable, as if the source of technical advancement was cut off. And when I started tracing where materials and technical documentation flowed after the war, I found something unexpected. Massive transfers of equipment and documents from facilities in Russia and Central Asia to Germany, specifically to secret research installations that weren't acknowledged until decades later. The official story says Germany was developing weapons in violation of the Versailles Treaty. But the volume of material suggests something larger, something that might explain where the technology came from in the first place. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, imposed severe restrictions on German military development. No air force, limited army, no submarines or capital warships. The treaty was designed to prevent Germany from ever threatening European peace again. Everyone knows Germany violated those restrictions throughout the 1920s and 30s, secretly rearming and developing prohibited weapons technologies. That's basic history. What's less discussed is where some of the technical knowledge for that rearmament came from. The standard narrative focuses on German ingenuity and institutional knowledge retained from the war. Despite restrictions, German engineers continued research through civilian corporations and clandestine military programs. When the Nazi Party came to power in 1933, they accelerated existing programs that had been developing in secret for years.
That's all documented and accurate. But there's another stream of knowledge that's harder to trace. Between 1920 and 1926, there was significant technical cooperation between Germany and Soviet Russia. Both nations were international pariahs after the war. Russia due to the Bolshevik Revolution, Germany due to defeat. They found common cause. The Treaty of Rapallo in 1922 formalized economic cooperation, but military cooperation existed informally well before that. German companies established facilities in Russia to develop technologies prohibited on German soil. The Soviets benefited from German technical expertise and industrial methods. This cooperation is historically acknowledged. What's less clear is exactly what was developed and where the foundational knowledge originated. I found references in German aviation archives to Eastern technical assessments and acquired Eastern methodologies in documents from the 1920s. The language is bureaucratic and vague, but it suggests knowledge transfer from Russian or Central Asian sources to German research programs. One document from 1924, part of a Junkers Company file, mentions frame analysis derived from Omsk facility materials in the context of all-metal aircraft development. Junkers was a pioneer in metal aircraft construction, but the reference to Omsk is interesting because that city was a major industrial center in Siberia with significant metalworking capacity during the imperial period. What materials? What facility? The document doesn't specify. Then there's the Lipetsk facility. Between 1924 and 1933, Germany operated a secret flight training and aircraft testing center near Lipetsk, deep inside Soviet Russia. German pilots trained there, away from Allied observation. Prohibited aircraft designs were tested. New technologies were evaluated. The facility was established through agreements between the Reichswehr, German military, and Soviet military authorities. When the Nazis came to power and began open rearmament, the facility was closed and German personnel returned home with knowledge gained from nearly a decade of unrestricted research. That's the official story of Lipetsk, and it's well documented. But here's what's strange. The Lipetsk site was chosen not just for secrecy, but because it was near existing industrial facilities that could support advanced aviation research. Those facilities, according to Soviet records, included warehouses containing technical materials from previous imperial programs. What programs? The records don't elaborate. The assumption in most historical accounts is that these were materials from Tsarist-era military industries, repurposed for Soviet use. But the timing is interesting. The Russian Civil War ended around 1922. The Bolsheviks spent the early 1920s consolidating control and dealing with economic collapse. The idea that they were carefully cataloging and preserving technical materials from imperial programs seems optimistic.
Unless those materials were valuable enough to prioritize, I started looking at German aviation development in the 1920s and 30s, specifically technical innovations that seemed to emerge without clear developmental lineage. The Junkers Ju-52, first flown in 1930, used a corrugated metal skin design that became iconic. But the specific alloy composition and fabrication technique appeared relatively suddenly in Junkers' work around 1928, without the gradual experimentation you'd expect. The Dornier DOX flying boat, designed in the late 20s, was the largest aircraft of its time, demonstrating structural engineering principles that pushed the boundaries of contemporary materials science. The Zeppelin LZ-129, later famous as the Hindenburg, incorporated design elements that solved problems earlier airships had struggled with, almost as if the designers had access to lessons learned from more advanced previous attempts. Now, it's entirely possible these were simply examples of excellent engineering and the natural progression of aviation technology. Talented designers build on each other's work. Innovations happen. But the pace of development in German aviation between 1925 and 1935 is notable, especially considering the country was operating under severe restrictions and economic hardship. Where was the knowledge base coming from? There's a pattern in the German documents, references to comprehensive technical acquisitions in 1919 through 1921, right after the war, from Eastern territories. The language is vague enough to be meaningless, but it appears repeatedly in budgetary and logistics records. One accounting document from 1920 lists expenditures for transport of archived materials from Siberian districts to provisional storage Königsberg. The amount allocated is substantial, equivalent to several $1 million in modern terms. You don't spend that kind of money moving useless paperwork. What were they moving? I tried to trace those materials. Königsberg, modern-day Kaliningrad, was heavily damaged in World War II.
Archives were destroyed, scattered, or seized by Soviet forces. Tracking specific document collections through that chaos is nearly impossible. But there are hints. A Soviet intelligence report from 1946 mentions discovering technical documentation of unknown origin, possibly pre-war German aviation research with unexplained technical sophistication, in facilities captured from German forces. The report recommends further analysis by Soviet aviation engineers. Then the trail goes cold. No follow-up documents are publicly available. Either the analysis happened and was classified, or it happened and found nothing worth reporting. Without access to Russian military archives, we can't know.
But here's what we can observe. After World War II, both the United States and Soviet Union engaged in Operation Paperclip and its Soviet equivalent, aggressively recruiting German scientists and seizing German technical documents. Both superpowers considered German wartime research valuable enough to prioritize in the chaos of post-war Europe. And some of that research, according to scattered references in declassified intelligence reports, involved anomalous technical concepts that didn't fit standard developmental histories, concepts that seemed to appear in German research fully formed without the experimental phases you'd expect, as if someone had handed them blueprints instead of making them derive everything from first principles. And when I started looking at where German expeditions went in the 1930s, when the Nazi regime was at its peak and exploring obsessively for technological and mystical advantages, one location kept appearing: Antarctica. A frozen continent with no strategic value, unless you believed something was hidden there, something worth sending 4,000 troops and an entire naval expedition to find. 1938 and 39, Nazi Germany launches the German Antarctic Expedition, officially named the New Swabia Expedition, sending the ship Schwabenland to explore and map portions of Antarctica. The stated goal: establish German territorial claims and prepare for potential whaling operations. The expedition was real, well documented, and photographed thousands of square kilometers of previously unmapped Antarctic territory. The standard historical interpretation is straightforward. Germany was looking for natural resources and strategic positioning as war approached. Several nations were interested in Antarctica during this period. Germany's expedition was part of that broader international competition. That explanation accounts for most of the known facts. But there are elements of the expedition that have generated persistent questions. The expedition dropped thousands of metal markers across the territory, claiming it for Germany. That's standard territorial behavior. But the expedition also took extensive aerial photographs of the interior, far beyond the coastal areas where whaling operations would be relevant. Some of those photographs, according to researchers who've examined them, show geographical anomalies, areas where the ice appears unusually thin or where rock formations suggest subsurface geological activity. Again, this could be entirely mundane. Antarctica has active geology, geothermal vents, volcanic activity. Finding unusual formations isn't strange. But Captain Alfred Richard, the expedition leader, mentioned in his report that they had identified areas of interest for future research without specifying what made those areas interesting. The expedition returned to Germany with extensive data, most of which was classified at the time. Why classify geographical survey data of an uninhabited continent? Then we get to 1947, and things get genuinely strange. Operation High Jump, a United States Navy expedition to Antarctica involving 13 ships, 4,700 personnel, and extensive military assets, including aircraft carriers and support vessels. It was and remains the largest Antarctic expedition ever mounted.
The official purpose: establish research stations, conduct scientific observations, test equipment in polar conditions, train personnel in Antarctic operations. Those are all legitimate goals, and the expedition accomplished them, but the scale seems disproportionate for scientific research. 4,700 personnel and 13 ships to study ice and penguins? Rear Admiral Richard Byrd led the operation. Byrd was experienced in polar exploration, well-respected, not prone to sensationalism. But after the expedition, he gave an interview to a Chilean newspaper, El Mercurio, where he made a strange statement. According to the interview published on March 5, 1947, Byrd warned about the possibility of an invasion by aircraft that can fly from pole to pole at incredible speeds. That's an odd thing to say after a scientific expedition, unless you encountered something that suggested such capabilities existed. Now, there's significant debate about whether Byrd actually said this or whether it's a mistranslation or fabrication. The original Spanish text is available, but context is unclear. Byrd never publicly repeated the statement, and no American sources from the time mention it. It could easily be journalistic sensationalism or a misunderstood comment, but it's worth noting that Operation High Jump was cut short. The expedition was planned for 6 to 8 months, but was terminated after only 8 weeks. The official reason: unexpected weather and equipment difficulties. Antarctic weather is always difficult. The expedition was prepared for polar conditions. What unexpected difficulties would cause a military operation of this scale to abort early? There's no clear answer in the declassified operational records. The expedition returned, submitted reports, and the matter was closed. Except it wasn't entirely closed. Between 1947 and 1952, the United States conducted several smaller Antarctic expeditions. Some were scientific, others involved military reconnaissance and mapping. The level of continued military interest in a region with no strategic value during the early Cold War is notable. Then, in 1958, the Antarctic Treaty was negotiated, prohibiting military activities on the continent and establishing it as a zone for scientific research only. The treaty was signed by 12 nations, including the United States and Soviet Union, enemies during the Cold War, but in agreement that Antarctica should be demilitarized. Why would Cold War adversaries agree to keep military forces out of Antarctica when they were competing militarily everywhere else? The standard answer is that Antarctica has no military value, and the treaty served scientific interests while preventing wasteful competition over a frozen wasteland.
That's reasonable. But it also means that if there were any military activities or discoveries in Antarctica prior to 1958, they would have been classified and removed before the treaty went into effect. I'm not claiming Nazis built secret bases in Antarctica, harbored advanced technology, or any of the more extreme theories that circulate about this period. Most of that is speculative fiction with no evidentiary support. What I'm observing is this: multiple expeditions by technologically advanced nations to a location with no obvious resource value, expeditions that were larger than necessary for their stated purposes, followed by an unusual international agreement to keep the entire continent demilitarized and closed to military activity. That pattern suggests something happened there that made continued military presence undesirable or unnecessary. What that something was, we don't know. The records are incomplete or classified. The witnesses are gone. We're left with fragments: Byrd's strange statement, the abbreviated expedition, the treaty that followed. And one more thing. In 1949, a Norwegian, British, Swedish Antarctic expedition reported discovering unusual magnetic anomalies in regions previously surveyed by both the German and American expeditions. The anomalies were noted but not explained. Follow-up research was planned but never conducted due to resource constraints. Magnetic anomalies in Antarctica aren't unusual. The continent has complex geology and strong magnetic variations, but finding them in areas that had been specifically surveyed by military expeditions within the previous decade is interesting timing. We're left with pieces that don't quite fit the standard historical narrative: a German expedition that mapped more than it needed to, an American military operation that deployed excessive force for scientific research and then left early, a warning about polar aircraft capabilities that may or may not have been accurately reported, and an international treaty that demilitarized the most remote place on Earth. Any one of these things is explainable, but together they suggest something happened in Antarctica between 1938 and 1958 that nations decided wasn't worth fighting over, or couldn't fight over, or needed to be contained. And that brings us to the present, because the geographical anomalies, the magnetic signatures, the restricted zones, they didn't disappear. They're still there, And some of them are in the same locations where those old photographs showed airship infrastructure, places that modern satellites can see but that remain curiously absent from public discussion. Which raises a final question. What don't we see because we're not looking, or because someone has made sure we won't find it even if we do?
The team's preliminary findings, posted briefly on a regional university website before being removed, mention structural remains of indeterminate origin and age, possibly related to industrial activity predating known settlement. Then, silence. No follow-up publications, no further data released. When asked, the university's administration states the research was discontinued due to lack of funding. I tried to contact members of that research team. One didn't respond, another said they were no longer working on that project and couldn't discuss it. A third, after some hesitation, said, "We were asked not to publish. The site is now part of a restricted conservation zone. That's all I can say." Restricted conservation zones aren't unusual. Governments protect environmentally or culturally significant sites all the time. But this particular zone was established quietly, with no public announcement, no environmental impact statements, no explanation of what was being conserved. I checked satellite imagery from commercial providers. The area is visible, heavily forested, no obvious structures or modern development, but there are patterns in the landscape, regular geometric shapes that could be natural geological features or could be something else, obscured by a century of vegetation growth. Those patterns align geographically with locations mentioned in some of the pre-1920 documents I found earlier, references to eastern manufacturing districts and transport infrastructure. Coincidence? Possibly. But then I found similar patterns in other locations across Central Asia. Near Omsk, outside Yekaterinburg, in the Altai region, all places mentioned in 19th century records as industrial or transport centers, all now either conservation zones, military restricted areas, or simply empty wilderness with no official explanation for why satellite imaging shows geometric landscape anomalies. 2019. A civilian pilot in Kazakhstan reports seeing unusual lights in a prohibited airspace zone at night. The lights appeared to be moving in formation, then accelerated at speeds the pilot described as impossible for conventional aircraft. The report was filed, investigated by aviation authorities, and closed as unexplained atmospheric phenomenon, no safety hazard. Why is airspace over empty steppe prohibited in the first place? The official designation is military training area, but locals say they never see military exercises there. No aircraft activity during the day, no ground vehicle movements, just a large area of land that civilians aren't allowed to enter or fly over. I spoke with a shepherd who grazes animals near the border of the zone. He mentioned that his grandfather told stories about skyboats that used to fly over that area before the Soviet times. The family thought they were folk tales until the grandfather showed them old photographs, blurry images of dark shapes in the sky that could be anything or could be exactly what the stories described. When I asked if I could see those photographs, the shepherd said his family no longer has them. Men from the local administration office came in the 1950s and borrowed them for official records. They were never returned.
2024. Satellite imaging companies begin offering high-resolution commercial imagery of previously undersurveyed regions. Researchers worldwide start examining areas that were difficult to access during the Cold War. Several independent researchers notice the same geometric patterns I did. Regular structures visible under vegetation in specific regions of Siberia and Central Asia. Online communities discuss the findings. Theories range from ancient civilizations to Soviet-era secret projects to natural geological formations. Then the imagery becomes unavailable. Not deleted, but access is restricted. The satellite companies cite licensing agreements with territorial governments that limit what areas can be made publicly available. The specific regions that showed the clearest geometric patterns,
all now excluded from commercial imagery services. You can still see them in older, lower-resolution images, but the high-detail scans that would allow proper analysis? Restricted. This is the pattern I keep encountering. Information appears briefly, generates questions, then becomes difficult to access. Archives get reorganized and documents become unfindable. Websites get taken down or edited. Witnesses become unwilling to talk. And I've only been able to compile what I have through months of research across multiple countries and languages. If this subject interests you, if you want to see what else I find as I continue digging into these geographic anomalies, the restricted zones, the satellite evidence, I'll be releasing more detailed analysis in upcoming videos. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it, because some of this material has a habit of disappearing after it's been noticed. The question is whether we're looking at coordinated suppression or just the natural entropy of historical information. Either way, the pattern is consistent. The closer you get to hard evidence, the harder it becomes to access. I'm not claiming a global conspiracy. I'm not suggesting governments worldwide are collaborating to hide lost technology or ancient civilizations or alien contact. What I'm observing is a consistent pattern across multiple countries and time periods. When evidence emerges that doesn't fit established historical narratives, it tends to become less accessible, reclassified, restricted, or simply lost in bureaucratic processes that make retrieval difficult. Sometimes that's intentional. National security concerns, territorial sensitivities, commercial interests all provide legitimate reasons to restrict information. Sometimes it's accidental. Archives are underfunded, documents decay, institutional memory fades. Nobody sets out to hide history, it just becomes unfindable through neglect. But the result is the same: gaps in the historical record that make certain questions impossible to answer conclusively. And those gaps align suspiciously well with the subject we've been exploring. The Tartarian airship question remains unresolved. We have photographs that some experts can't explain and others dismiss as hoaxes. We have witness testimonies that are either accurate observations or cultural mythologizing. We have geographical anomalies that might be structural remains or natural formations. We have technological developments that either progressed naturally or were informed by unknown sources. Every piece of evidence has a conventional explanation. Every piece of evidence also has questions that the conventional explanation doesn't fully address. The absence of definitive proof doesn't mean something did happen, but it also doesn't mean something didn't happen. It means we don't have enough information to be certain. And that uncertainty is what makes this fascinating. Because in the gaps between what we're told and what the evidence suggests, there's room for questions. Questions about who decides what history is. Questions about what knowledge might have existed and been lost or suppressed. Questions about whether our understanding of technological development is complete or whether we're missing chapters. I started this investigation expecting to find clear answers. Either the Tartarian airship story is a modern myth with no historical basis, or there's concrete evidence of advanced 19th century aviation that mainstream history ignores. What I found instead is ambiguity. Enough evidence to suggest something unusual was happening, but not enough to prove any specific interpretation. Enough gaps in the record to make definitive claims impossible, but not enough clarity to dismiss the questions entirely. And that ambiguity might be the most important finding, because it means we can't be certain about what we think we know. It means history is less settled than we assume. It means there might be entire chapters of human technical achievement that are either lost, hidden, or misunderstood. Or it means people are very good at seeing patterns that aren't there and constructing narratives from incomplete information. Both possibilities are humbling in different ways. So I'm leaving this open, not because I don't have an opinion, but because certainty without sufficient evidence is just ideology. I've shown you what I found. Photographs that don't fit the timeline, testimonies that describe capabilities beyond known technology, geographical patterns that might indicate infrastructure, restricted zones that might be hiding something or might just be protecting wilderness. What do you make of it? Not what do you want to believe, what does the evidence actually support? Because that's the harder question, and it's the one worth asking. If you're still thinking about this, if the questions bother you the way they bother me, leave a comment, not with a theory or a belief, but with your assessment of what would constitute sufficient evidence to resolve this one way or another. What would prove advanced 19th century aviation existed? What would prove it didn't? What would change your mind?
And subscribe if you want to see where this goes next, because I'm not done. There are more restricted zones, more archives, more witnesses who might still be willing to talk, and maybe, eventually, enough pieces to see the full picture. Or maybe we'll just find more questions. Either way, it's worth looking. Here's what I can't resolve. If this technology never existed, why does the evidence keep appearing and then disappearing? Why the restricted zones over empty wilderness? Why the classified assessments of unidentified aircraft capabilities? Why the international agreement to demilitarize Antarctica when Cold War enemies couldn't agree on anything else? But if the technology did exist, where did it go? Technology doesn't just vanish. Knowledge persists. Engineers talk. Blueprints get copied. Nothing stays secret forever. So either we're seeing patterns in noise, constructing elaborate stories from misunderstood fragments of ordinary history, or we're missing something fundamental about technological development, historical preservation, and what powerful institutions decide the rest of us should know. I don't know which is true. Do you?